For over a decade, Dan Blocker brought Hoss Cartwright to life on Bonanza, becoming one of television's most beloved figures. His towering presence was matched only by the warmth, humor, and kindness he poured into his role. Fans saw him as the heart of the Cartwright family, a man whose good-natured spirit and unwavering loyalty made him unforgettable. But beyond the screen, Dan Blocker was more than just a gentle giant. His real-life journey was filled with challenges, triumphs, and secrets that remained buried for years. Now, at 66, one of his sons has come forward, confirming a long-rumored truth, one that changes everything we thought we knew about the man behind Hoss. But before we unveil this revelation, we need to go back. To understand the truth, we must first understand the man. His childhood, his battles, his rise to fame, every moment shaped the legend he became. This is the untold story of Dan Blocker. He came into this world larger than life, quite literally. Born Bobby Dan Davis Blocker on December 10, 1928, in the small town of Kalb, Texas, he tipped the scales at a staggering 14 pounds at birth. It was a fitting beginning for a man who would grow to be one of television's most unforgettable figures. Raised in O'Donnell, Texas, Dan's childhood was shaped by hard work and small-town values. His parents owned a modest grocery store, and from an early age, he was hauling bags of grain, carrying supplies, and doing whatever was needed to help keep the family business running. By age 10, he was already doing the work of a grown man, and his incredible strength quickly became legendary. By the time he was 12, Dan Blocker was already a towering figure, standing at an incredible 6 feet tall and weighing over 200 pounds. The local kids called him the Big Un, and even adults took notice of his size and power. His imposing presence led to plenty of challenges from neighborhood toughs, but no one ever got the better of him in a fight. Even then, Dan had an unshakable sense of fairness. He never started trouble, but he always finished it. High school brought another outlet for his strength: football. He was a natural on the field, and his sheer size made him an unstoppable force. His talent earned him a scholarship to Texas Military Institute, where he continued to develop both his physical abilities and his discipline. But while football was his focus, another unexpected path would soon present itself. He took his skills to Sul Ross State University, still dedicated to the dream of playing professional football. But fate had other plans. One day, his college drama club was in desperate need of someone to help move heavy props for a production of Arsenic and Old Lace. Naturally, Dan was the first person they turned to. It was supposed to be a simple favor, just some heavy lifting and stage handwork. But something about the energy of the stage, the thrill of storytelling, caught his attention. When one of the actors dropped out of the play, Dan was asked to step in. At first, he hesitated, unsure if acting was for him. But the moment he delivered his first line, something clicked. The crowd, the applause, the rush of stepping into another world, it was intoxicating. Before he knew it, he had gone from a football player to a theater major, shifting his entire focus toward the art of performance. His love for acting grew quickly, but so did another duty, one he couldn't ignore. After college, Dan was drafted into the U.S. Army, and soon he was sent overseas to fight in the Korean War. The battlefield was nothing like the stage, but it tested his strength and resilience in ways he had never imagined. When he returned home, Hollywood wasn't waiting for him with open arms. He had no connections, no fame, and no easy way in. To support his growing family, he took on a series of odd jobs, teaching school, selling cars, even working as a bouncer. But the dream of acting never left him. Finally, he caught a break. The rise of westerns in television meant casting agents were constantly searching for men with a rugged look and Dan Blocker fit the bill perfectly. His first roles were small, bit parts on shows like Gunsmoke and The Rifleman, but even in those minor appearances, he stood out. His presence, his voice, his ability to bring charm and humor to every role, Hollywood was beginning to take notice. Then, in 1957, he landed a role on The Restless Gun, a Western series that put him in front of a larger audience. His performance caught the attention of producers, leading to more roles in Cimarron City and Cult .45. Bit by bit, he was carving out a place for himself in the industry. And then, everything changed. A new Western series was being developed, one that would become one of the biggest television shows of all time. The producers were looking for someone who could embody strength, warmth, and humor all at once. Someone who could bring depth to a character who was more than just a tough cowboy. That's when they found Dan Blocker, and the role they had in mind would turn him into a household name. He had always been big, always been strong, but nothing could prepare him for the harsh realities of war. After college, Dan Blocker's path took an unexpected turn when he was drafted into the United States Army. He was no longer just a small-town Texan with a love for the stage. He was now a soldier, a man called to serve in one of the most brutal conflicts of the 20th century. At 6'4" and over 275 pounds, he was larger than most of his fellow recruits, and the Army took notice. His sheer size and strength made him a force to be reckoned with, but they also presented logistical challenges. Standard issue boots and uniforms didn't fit him. It took weeks just to get him properly equipped. But once he was ready, he was sent to Korea, where he would face battles unlike anything he had ever imagined. It was the winter of 1951 when he found himself stationed near Chang, North Korea, serving as a combat infantry sergeant with the 179th Infantry Regiment. The conditions were brutal. Temperatures dropped well below freezing, supplies were stretched thin, and the enemy was relentless. Trench warfare defined the battlefield, turning every inch of ground into a hard-fought prize. And then came Pork Chop Hill. It was one of the bloodiest and most unforgiving battlegrounds of the Korean War. The terrain was harsh, the fighting was relentless, and survival was far from guaranteed. Night after night, enemy forces launched relentless assaults, testing the endurance of every soldier who dared to stand his ground. In the middle of that chaos, Dan Blocker did what few had the courage to do. One night, amidst the deafening explosions and the screams of wounded men, he spotted a fellow soldier trapped under heavy fire, unable to move. Without hesitation, he charged into the line of fire, bullets whizzing past him as he reached his fallen comrade. He hoisted the wounded man onto his back, shielding him with his own massive frame as he carried him to safety. But heroism comes at a cost. Before he could make it back to cover, a sharp pain tore through his side. He had been hit. The injury was serious, but it didn't stop him. He kept moving, refusing to leave his brother behind. When he finally made it back to safety, his fellow soldiers watched in disbelief. He had done what seemed impossible, and because of his actions, a man who would have been left for dead got a second chance at life. For his bravery, Dan Blocker was awarded the Purple Heart, but he never saw himself as a hero. He rarely spoke about his time in Korea, never boasting about the battle scars he carried. To him, war wasn't something to glorify. It was something to endure, something that left too many good men broken or buried before their time. When he finally returned home, he was not the same man who had left. The war had changed him. He had seen firsthand the cost of battle, the pain, the loss, the senseless destruction. It left him with a deep and lasting conviction. War should never be the first answer. As he built his life after the military, Dan Blocker became one of the rare public figures willing to speak out against war, even when it was unpopular to do so. He openly criticized unnecessary military interventions, condemned the use of napalm, and stood firmly against conflicts that put young soldiers in harm's way for political gain. He understood duty, he understood sacrifice, but he also understood that too often war was waged by men in suits, while it was fought and bled for by men in uniform. And he never forgot what it meant to be on the front lines. Though the world would come to know him as Hoss Cartwright, the gentle giant with a kind heart, the man behind the character had seen war, had carried its weight, and had made a promise to himself to use his voice for something greater. And that promise would stay with him for the rest of his life. He never set out to be a star. Fame was never the goal, but fate had a way of pulling Dan Blocker toward a destiny he never could have predicted. In the late 1950s, Hollywood was hungry for westerns. Audiences couldn't get enough of tales from the frontier, of rugged men taming the wild, of justice won and lost in the dust of the Old West. Studios were looking for the next big hit, a show that would captivate the country. And that's when a new series came into development, one unlike anything that had been done before. It was called Bonanza. The show wasn't just another Western, it had something different: heart. At its core, it wasn't about gunfights or outlaws, it was about family, about loyalty, about the deep, unshakable bond between a father and his sons. The producers wanted actors who could bring real depth to the roles, men who could embody the values at the heart of the show. When Dan Blocker walked into the audition, it was clear he was born to play Hoss Cartwright. He was impossible to ignore. His sheer size made sure of that. But it was his presence that truly won them over. His kindness, his humor, the way he could make a room feel at ease with just a smile. Hoss wasn't just a role. He was Dan, through and through. And just like that, Dan Blocker became a household name. From the moment Bonanza hit the airwaves in 1959, audiences fell in love with the Cartwright family. There was Ben, the wise and steadfast patriarch. Adam, the eldest son, logical and strong. Little Joe, full of charm and mischief. But it was Hoss, gentle, kind, larger than life, who stole the show. Hoss wasn't just a cowboy. He was the soul of the Ponderosa. He was the one who saw the good in people, the one who could be fierce when he needed to be, but never cruel. He was the protector, the peacekeeper, the heart of the family. And it wasn't an act. Dan Blocker brought his own values to the role. The belief that kindness was a strength, that fairness mattered, that a man's worth was measured by how he treated others. Audiences adored him. Children especially saw Hoss as their favorite, a towering giant who never used his strength to bully, only to protect. Fan mail poured in. Viewers felt like they knew him, like he was family. Behind the scenes, Bonanza became more than just a job for Dan. It became a second home. He and his co-stars formed a bond that went far beyond the cameras. Lorne Greene, who played Ben Cartwright, became a father figure to him in real life. Michael Landon, the mischievous and quick-witted Little Joe, was like a brother. The three of them shared laughter, stories, and countless hours on set, building a friendship that would last a lifetime. When Michael Landon got married, there was only one man he wanted standing beside him as his best man, Dan Blocker. Because that's who Dan was, the guy who would always show up, the friend who was always there. But with fame came a burden he never anticipated. Dan loved the work, loved the craft of acting. But the spotlight? That was something else entirely. Everywhere he went, people recognized him. At first, it was flattering, the warmth, the appreciation, but over time, it became overwhelming. He couldn't take his family on a simple vacation without being swarmed by fans. A quiet dinner out turned into a public event. Even in places far from Hollywood, people knew Hoss Cartwright. He was grateful, always grateful, but he missed the simplicity of the life he had before. In his heart, he was still the boy from Texas, the kid who worked in his family's grocery store, the man who just wanted to do his job and go home to his wife and kids. But Bonanza wasn't just a job anymore. It was a phenomenon. The show dominated television for over a decade, making history as one of the longest-running westerns ever. And through it all, Dan Blocker remained at the heart of it, laughing, loving, bringing Hoss Cartwright to life in a way that no one else ever could. Yet deep down, he knew that nothing lasted forever, that the winds of change would come, and when they did, he would have to decide what mattered more, the fame he never wanted, or the quiet life he had always dreamed of. He wasn't just a TV cowboy. He wasn't just the lovable giant in a Western drama. Dan Blocker was a man of principle, a man who stood for something, even when it wasn't easy. During the height of Bonanza's success, Hollywood often took the cast on location for filming. One of those trips took them deep into the South, a place where racial tensions still ran high, where segregation was still enforced in ways both blatant and cruel. When the Bonanza crew arrived at a hotel, they were met with a quiet but unmistakable injustice. The African-American members of their team were told they couldn't stay there. It was an unspoken rule in certain places. Certain people weren't welcome. Dan Blocker didn't hesitate. He didn't negotiate. He didn't try to reason with management. Instead, he made one thing crystal clear. If they don't stay, none of us stay. The hotel manager was stunned. Losing one guest was nothing. Losing an entire television production? That was another story. In the end, the hotel backed down. The Bonanza crew stayed together. And Dan? He never made a speech about it, never used it for headlines. To him, it wasn't about making a statement. It was about doing what was right. That was who he was, a man who never used his strength to intimidate, but to protect. A man who saw injustice and refused to look away. But for all his heroics, for all the seriousness of his beliefs, there was one thing Dan Blocker was famous for that had nothing to do with acting, nothing to do with activism: his appetite. Dan Blocker didn't just eat, he devoured. Breakfast alone was a feast fit for a king. A dozen eggs, 2 loaves of bread, gallons of milk. And that was just the start. He had an endless love for meat, steaks the size of dinner plates, entire hams roasted to perfection. He had a notorious sweet tooth, indulging in pies and cakes, with the same enthusiasm he brought to everything else in life. On set, his ability to eat became legendary. Cast and crew would watch in awe as he demolished plate after plate of food, barely pausing between bites. Some even made bets. How much could he finish? The answer was always the same: all of it. It was no surprise then when he got involved in the restaurant business. He became part owner of the Ponderosa Steakhouse chain, named after the ranch that made Bonanza famous. It was the perfect fit. He got to combine his love for food with his love for the show. And as a co-owner, he had a perk he absolutely loved. He could eat at any location for free. But for all the laughter, all the larger-than-life stories, there was something weighing on him. Something that never fully went away. Fame had given him so much: a career, security for his family, a place in television history. But it had also taken things from him: privacy, peace, a quiet life. The world saw him as Hoss Cartwright. But Dan Blocker? He was still that small-town Texan, still the man who never asked for fame in the first place. And so, in the early 1970s, he made a decision, one that shocked many. He packed up his family and moved halfway across the world to Switzerland. It wasn't a retirement. It wasn't running away. It was a choice to give his children a different life, to escape the constant attention, to find a place where he could walk down the street without being stopped every 5 steps. Switzerland offered him the kind of anonymity he had never known. Over there, Bonanza was dubbed in German, and most people didn't recognize him. He could sit in a cafe, take in the beauty of the Swiss countryside, and just be. But no matter how far he moved, no matter how much he tried to step back, Bonanza was always with him. He still traveled back to the US for filming, still showed up for the fans who had loved him for so long, because at the end of the day, he was more than Hoss Cartwright. He was Dan Blocker, a man who stood for what was right, a man who lived life to the fullest, and a man who, even in the quiet moments, never forgot where he came from. It was supposed to be a simple procedure, a routine surgery, nothing to worry about. In 1972, Dan Blocker checked into the hospital for a gallbladder removal. It wasn't an emergency. It wasn't life-threatening. Just a standard operation, one that thousands of people underwent every day. No one could have predicted what would happen next. At first, everything seemed fine. The surgery went as planned, and there were no immediate complications. But then, out of nowhere, tragedy struck. A blood clot formed, a pulmonary embolism. It traveled through his body, cutting off circulation when no one could stop it. And just like that, Dan Blocker was gone. He was only 43 years old, a husband, a father, a man who had survived war, who had built a life for himself from the ground up, who had given the world a character they would never forget. His sudden passing sent shockwaves through Hollywood. Co-stars were devastated. Fans struggled to believe it was real. Bonanza had been an unstoppable force for over a decade, but now it was missing its heart. The loss of Hoss Cartwright wasn't something that could be ignored. His absence wasn't something that could be explained away with a simple storyline. Michael Landon and the producers faced an impossible decision. How do you continue Bonanza without the man who made it whole? In the first episode after his passing, there were no dramatic explanations, no forced plot lines. Instead, Bonanza honored Dan's memory in the most real way possible, through silence. Hoss wasn't written off with a dramatic death or a sudden disappearance. He was just gone. And that absence was felt in every frame, every quiet moment where his presence should have been. But without him, something changed. The show had been built on the chemistry of its cast, on the unbreakable bond of the Cartwright family. And now, that family had been shattered. Audiences felt it too. Ratings began to drop. The network moved the show from its long-standing Sunday night slot, hoping a new time would keep it alive. It didn't. A year later, Bonanza was canceled. After 14 years, the era of the Cartwrights had come to an end. But even in death, Dan Blocker became the center of one final legend. A rumor spread, one that seemed almost fitting for a man of his size and stature. The story claimed that when it came time to bury him, a traditional casket simply wouldn't do. That instead, they placed him in an oversized piano box and lowered him into the ground. It was the kind of tale that felt too strange to be real. And that's because it wasn't. Dan Blocker was buried in a standard casket, laid to rest at Woodlawn Cemetery in Santa Monica, California. There was no piano box, no elaborate struggle to accommodate his frame. Just a simple, quiet goodbye to a man who had lived a life far bigger than the roles he played. The show may have ended. The cameras may have stopped rolling, but the legend of Dan Blocker? That would never fade. He was larger than life, both on screen and off. But to one person, he wasn't a television icon, he wasn't Hoss Cartwright, he was just Dad. Dirk Blocker grew up in the shadow of a giant, not just in stature, but in presence. Dan Blocker wasn't just the warm-hearted cowboy America adored. He was a man whose laughter filled every room, whose kindness extended far beyond what the world ever saw. But growing up with a father as famous as Dan Blocker wasn't always easy. Dirk watched as his dad struggled with the price of fame. He saw how his father could never go anywhere without being recognized, how family vacations turned into public events, how privacy became a luxury that no amount of money could buy. And when Dan was gone, Dirk saw something else. The weight of grief, not just within his family, but in the millions of fans who felt they had lost a member of their own household. Dirk Blocker loved acting, but he also saw what fame had done to his father. The endless attention, the expectations, the inability to simply exist without being watched. And so, when Dirk entered the world of entertainment, he made a different choice. He didn't chase the spotlight. He didn't seek out leading roles or a career built on fame. Instead, he became a character actor, someone who could work in Hollywood without the world knowing his name. It was a deliberate decision, one shaped by the lessons he learned from his father. Dirk never resented his father's fame. He admired him, respected him, understood the sacrifices he made. But he also knew he wanted a different path, a quieter life. And yet, no matter how much time passed, no matter how much Dirk built a name for himself in his own right, one truth remained. He was forever connected to Dan Blocker. People still asked him about Hoss. They still wanted to share their memories, their admiration, their gratitude. For years, there was something people had always suspected about Dan Blocker. Something beyond his talent, beyond his towering presence. And now, at 66, Dirk Blocker has confirmed what many had long believed. Dan Blocker wasn't just a great actor. He wasn't just a television star. He was a man of integrity, of conviction, of deep and unwavering kindness. He was a man who believed in fairness, who fought against injustice not because it was popular, but because it was right. He was a man who carried the weight of war, but never let it harden his heart. He was a man who, despite all the fame, all the attention, remained the same humble, good-natured soul he had always been. His legacy wasn't just in the episodes of Bonanza that continue to air, or in the reruns that bring Hoss Cartwright back to life for new generations. It wasn't just in the laughter he shared with castmates, or in the larger-than-life stories that made him unforgettable. His true legacy was in the lives he touched, the values he passed on, the example he set. And while the world lost Dan Blocker far too soon, his son ensures that his story, the real story, the man behind the legend, will never be forgotten. Dan Blocker was more than a television icon, more than the gentle giant audiences fell in love with. He was a man of heart, of integrity, of unwavering kindness, a man who stood up for what was right, who valued family above all else, and who left behind a legacy that went far beyond the screen. To those who knew him personally, he was a loyal friend, a devoted husband, and a father whose love knew no bounds. To millions of fans, he was Hoss Cartwright, the soul of Bonanza, the man who made the Ponderosa feel like home. But no matter how the world saw him, one truth remains. Dan Blocker left an impact that time will never erase. His story, his principles, and his spirit live on, not just in old episodes of Bonanza, but in the people who still carry his memory. Now, we want to hear from you. What's your favorite Dan Blocker moment? Was it a scene from Bonanza? A story you've heard about his kindness? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this look into his life, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the legends who shaped Hollywood.